Hi, everyone. Welcome to our channel, Captain World. Douglas Macgregor expresses a sentiment about the situation, stating that he would feel better if the conflict had concluded earlier, preventing the unnecessary loss of lives among Ukrainians and Russians. He characterizes the conflict as pointless and emphasizes the belief that it never needed to occur in the first place. Douglas Macgregor characterizes the conflict as a wash and vanity project, asserting that individuals in Washington with support from allies in London and other European capitals believed they had an opportunity to undermine Russia and opted to use Ukraine for that purpose. According to Macgregor, this plan had been in the works for many years, not just the 8 years leading up to the war, but even earlier, contributing to the coup and the subsequent installation of the Zelensky government. He dismisses this approach as fantasy, making no logical sense, with all the underlying assumptions proving incorrect. Macgregor criticizes individuals in the Department of Defense, particularly retired and active generals, many of whom lack practical military experience and seldom bothered to study their professions. They all, according to him, rallied behind the idea, wrongly predicting imminent victory for Ukraine. Douglas Macgregor criticizes the pervasive dishonesty surrounding the conflict, noting the prolific and convincingly rhetorical lies asserting that the Russians were losing and had no chance of winning. He highlights the lack of admission into truth, claiming that roughly 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died. A stark contrast to a retired general's suggestion of 125,000. Macgregor expresses frustration with the argument that more spending and equipment will lead to Ukraine's triumph, asserting that the Russians are advancing deliberately but slowly. He speculates that Mr. Putin seeks a negotiating partner among European states, not an advance to the Polish border. Macgregor emphasizes the need to negotiate and end the war, warning that refusing to do so will not only destroy Ukraine, but also move Russian forces further west, contrary to the initial goals. He laments that the current situation has unintentionally strengthened the Russian armed forces, deviating from the intended outcomes of the conflict. Douglas Macgregor identifies a persistent issue in both Britain and the United States, involving senior military and political leaders who are often swayed by wishful thinking, accepting things as true when they are not. He sees this as another example of such a pattern compounded by corruption, greed, and what he perceives as heightened arrogance in Washington. Macgregor expresses astonishment at the level of arrogance, considering the decades of military, strategic, and political failures, along with economic challenges. He suggests that given these circumstances, one would expect a degree of humility to have developed. However, he contends that the truth is not admitted, lies persist, and arrogance prevails. Douglas Macgregor speculates on the motives of an individual, suggesting that they may have believed they possess access to Epstein tapes and intended to leverage them to gain support from President Biden and colleagues. However, Macgregor notes that this tactic seems to have failed, speculating that the tapes may not have been sufficient or lack significant content. He criticizes generals who, in his view, are merely waiting to retire and secure lucrative contracts with the defense industry. Macgregor asserts that these generals perform not just for their political sponsors, but also for their future employers and shareholders, assuring them that they can sell their products regardless of the outcome. He acknowledges that the world is aware of the situation and that concealing the truth will be challenging. Douglas Macgregor criticizes the failure of the Western-trained Ukrainian force, attributing it not solely to their shortcomings, but also to the inadequate training, organization, and equipment provided by Western nations. He asserts that Western technology and advice have also proven to be inadequate. Macgregor expressed his surprise that President Putin has an offer to reimburse London and Washington for the retired generals sent to advise Ukraine, as he sees them as Putin's greatest assets due to their perceived incompetence. He decries the prevailing attitude of viewing Russians as mediocre and subhuman, labeling it as outrageous nonsense that was never true. Macgregor points out that this perspective has poisoned the well with Russia for at least a decade or more, making it challenging for the Russians to trust anything said by Western nations, given the perceived history of lies. Douglas Macgregor contends that everything Western nations have done has been aimed at subverting and alienating Russia, characterizing it as a serious mistake. He expresses hope for a new generation of political leaders who can reverse this trend. In fact, Macgregor believes that the worst part is that the rest of the world now perceives the West as weak. He anticipates that this weakness will become more evident in the future, extending to the Middle East, asserting that the United States is not the power, or it was 30 years ago, and is far from being as influential. The Fed's block or worry emphasizes the lack of information among people in the United States and the challenges in getting them informed. He notes that many Americans are more preoccupied with entertainment and celebrity news, such as football games and Taylor Swift's relationships, rather than being engaged with geopolitical events. Macgregor highlights a general disinterest in the Middle East, with people considering it a minor issue that will soon pass, drawing parallels to previous conflicts between Israelis and Arabs. He points out that during the Cold War, it was easier to convince Americans that Russians were bad due to the geopolitical tensions of that era. Macgregor implies that the current lack of attention and awareness among the public contributes to a superficial understanding of complex global issues. Douglas Macgregor highlights the ease with which Cold War propaganda could be recycled and used to shape public opinion. He notes a similar issue with perceptions of Muslim Arabs expressing a sentiment of indifference, saying, "Muslim Arabs, we've been fighting them for years. The hell with them. Let's hope the Israelis do a great job." Macgregor points out the lack of understanding about the humanitarian dimension of the situation and a general lack of interest. He anticipates that this approach will have long-term consequences, but acknowledges that for now, it doesn't seem to be impacting public sentiment or awareness in the United States. Macgregor discusses the significant impact of how this impractically shutting down the Suez Canal for much of the commercial traffic. He considers this a remarkable achievement, noting that ships are now sailing around the Cape to avoid the Red Sea. Now, Macgregor mentions that he's waiting for someone in Washington to decide to commit a substantial number of Marine infantry to land in Yemen, drawing on the British experience in the region. He emphasizes the importance of diplomatic efforts before military actions, citing the British practice of thoroughly considering with whom they can practice economy and which entities will collaborate with them. Sir Macgregor suggests that this approach is preferable to launching into conflicts without proper communication and understanding. Douglas Macgregor contrasts the historical approach of British diplomats, particularly Sir Richard Francis Burton, with the current strategy of Western nations. He emphasizes that the British were adept at narrowing down opposition and seeking assistance from allies, showcasing a more nuanced and diplomatic approach. Macgregor criticizes the contemporary method, describing it as using a sledgehammer, where everything and everyone is smashed, leading to a lack of friends in the region. He points out that the U.S. has no friends in Iraq, and only some Kurds support them in Syria. Macgregor suggests that the current approach has alienated Iranians, Turkey, and Arabs, predicting a prolonged conflict. He also comments on the ongoing situation in Gaza, predicting a grim outcome involving expulsion or the killing of the remaining population. Douglas Macgregor envisions a protracted conflict in the Middle East and highlights the concept of a sayya by ayah, rooted in the writings of the Muslim, historically, Ibn Khaldun. He emphasizes the influence of Islam on social cohesion in the region. Macgregor notes that the world has changed with better educated populations having access to technology and information. He argues that the people in the Middle East are well aware of the ongoing events, with millions of Turkey, Arabs, Iranians, Egyptians, and others cognizant of the situation. Macgregor concludes by asserting that anyone anticipating a swift resolution to the conflicts at a time. Douglas Macgregor expresses concern about the current situation, describing it as the beginning of a dangerous period. He criticized the Israeli actions, believing that they have underestimated the impact of their actions. Simultaneously, he observes that the United States is making efforts to influence the Lebanese government and Hezbollah, attempting to prevent conflict. However, Macgregor is skeptical about the effectiveness of these measures, predicting that the situation will worsen, especially in the spring. He anticipates a protracted and unpleasant war that will be challenging for all involved. Douglas